All right, ladies and gentlemen, sorry for the delay. Thank you guys for all coming out to talk with one of the most fun and exciting topics at the conference, everybody's favorite, vendor management, or third-party risk management, or whatever you guys want to call it at your organizations. We've been doing this a long time here at SBS CyberSecurity, and we just call it vendor management, but it takes a lot of different names, a lot of different shapes: supply chain management, TPRM. We're all talking about kind of the same objective. So my contact information is listed out on your screen here. I don't have my cool fonts. Sorry, I'm a big nerd, but I digitized myself to make myself look cooler. My company is SBS CyberSecurity. We're based out of South Dakota. We've been in the cybersecurity game since 2005, so 20 years this year. I've been doing this a long time. And we've been doing vendor management almost as long. So if you guys have any questions, I'll be around the rest of the conference. Appreciate any conversation that you guys might have. So we're going to talk a little bit today about the objective here is how to do vendor management and vendor risk assessments to help you make good business decisions, right? That's been kind of a big theme if you guys have been listening to talks around here, because I'll get to that next slide, I guess, here in a moment. Cybersecurity is a business decision. And I'll leave this up here for a moment. I've got a bunch of downloads with the slide, or with this slide deck, with this talk. And I've learned that I talk a lot, and I'm probably going to get the sign, and it might come a little earlier than I hope due to some of the timing things. But I wanted to put this up here first so you guys can go check out. We've got a page where you can go download a number of different things, as well as the PowerPoint. I know the RVAsec crew will have that to distribute as well. And there's a survey. You can tell me how we're doing on this thing. And we do a lot of training and education, so we're giving away some free paid-for expert content webinars and some memberships if you guys take our survey and let us know how we do. But there's 6 free downloads here. We have a cybersecurity newsletter that's really cool and interesting. It's not going to try to sell you anything. It's just a cool newsletter about what's happening in the world of cyber called In the Wild. We send that out every Sunday. So if you guys want to check that out, I'll put this up again at the end so long as I have time. But in interest of time, we're going to talk a little bit about what does modern vendor management really look like today, and how can you build a program that works for you. So who here, quick show of hands, does something in the world of vendor management at your organizations? That's a lot of you. I'm impressed, because 10 years ago, there would have been 3 hands. So when it comes to vendor management, third-party risk management, it affects all of us, all of our businesses, all of our organizations, because cybersecurity is more than a technology issue, it's a business issue, right? So how do we leverage that thing that usually gets lumped on IT or information security, and they say, hey, this is a thing, you guys have to handle this, you figure it out, right? This is a third-party risk thing. So when we first started SBS 20 years ago, we had a very rudimentary version of what an information security program, which is what we call it, looked like then. And it's grown and expanded, and this is kind of what a modern information security program looks like. Lots of different stuff, lots of different layers. But you've got high-level policies, you've got day-to-day operational procedures, you've got results, and all of this stuff has to flow upstream. So from there, one of the things that we talk about a lot is, well, at SBS, we're really a cybersecurity risk management company first and foremost. That's how we cut our chops in the banking and finance sector 20 years ago, is helping banks really understand what it is that they have, how risky it is, and how do you manage that risk. That's really all we're about. Our idea, our whole mission is to help our clients really understand what it is that they have and how they mitigate and manage that risk. Can you get to 100% risk mitigation in our world? Even if you had unlimited time, money, effort, and resources, is it possible to get to 0% outside of disconnecting from the internet? It is, theoretically, right? But there's a new vulnerability discovered every 44 seconds. So you're not going to be there for very long. So we're talking a little bit about how do you get to an acceptable level of risk. And we'll kind of talk a little bit about how we do that. And we do it in 4 different ways. Again, this is most of the clients that we work with are in regulated industry, so a lot of them are required to do these types of things. And we try to take those, hey, here's a checklist thing. How do you take that and make it work for you so it is valuable? You're going to have to spend a whole boatload of time and money and energy doing the checkbox thing. You might as well make it worth your while. So there's 4 types of risk assessments that we usually do with clients, starting at the IT asset level, right? What are all your IT assets? What are your systems? What are the things where the actual threats occur that you're logging into, you're leveraging, that are storing, transmitting, processing data? That's kind of the foundation. And then you go up a level to the vendor risk, which is where we're going to talk today. Vendor risk assessment is not just about how healthy a company is, whether that organization is the right partner for you from a security perspective. Those are important things. But what do vendors provide us? IT assets, the systems, the SaaS products, the hardware, the software, the things that we use, right? So those things are interconnected. You can't remove one from the other. Then that works up into a business process risk assessment or a business impact analysis to say, all right, what are our business processes look like? Can you have a business process today without vendors and without IT assets? Probably not. So, and then all of that kind of goes up into your organizational cyber maturity framework situations. So from our perspective, we take that vendor element and we break it down into 3 aspects. The first is the vendor risk assessment, where we'll spend a bunch of time talking today. How do you really understand what you have from your vendors? How do you identify that risk, and how do you break your vendors up into different vendor levels? Then we'll talk about vendor selection. How do you leverage this process to make good choices in terms of what vendors you want to do business with? And then you've got ongoing vendor management, vendors that you work with, have worked with, and how do you make good decisions around if you want to continue to do business with them, other than they're a good vendor, right? So we'll break that down pretty high level from that perspective. But a lot of people are like, well, hey, how do you make this quantifiable, John? So we have kind of the same framework as Chris Hoff talked about, things being quantifiable. Dan in here earlier talked about things being quantifiable, right? So how do we quantify vendor risk as an example? So this is the same framework that we use for all of our risk assessments. You start with a thing, an object, and you leverage that thing to create what we would call a protection profile. So in this case, we use 4 categories to determine a protection profile. From a vendor perspective, how confidential is the data that this vendor is storing, transmitting, and processing on our behalf? And most of the time, a vendor profile stops there, right? These guys have PII or NPI or whatever acronym you want to assign to confidential customer information. Do they have it? Yes, then they are a critical vendor. That is not correct, because that might be a whole boatload of critical vendors at your organization. Then you have to ask other questions like, hey, well, what happens if that vendor goes away? Do we stop doing business? And if the answer is no, we don't stop doing business, it might suck for a little while, then they're not necessarily a mission critical vendor. So we add a couple other categories in, like, do they have access to customer information? We kind of rate that out on a high, medium, low scale. So on a confidentiality of data, like confidential customer information is a high, internal sensitive information is a medium, public information is a low. On the customer information side, do they have access to it? Yes, they have read and write access. That would be a high. They have read-only access. That's a medium. They don't have access at all. That's a low. How many assets do we have with this vendor? Going back to our IT assets, right? You know, if they provide us one application, okay, that's one thing. Do we have 5, 6, 7, 8 applications or products or services with this vendor? That's another thing, right? So the more stuff we have with the vendor, the more important they're going to be. And then the last one is that availability. What's the availability requirement of this vendor? Are they mission critical? If something happens to this vendor, do we stop doing business? Or do we have some teams or departments or business processes that maybe don't function for a little while, but we can still serve our customers, right? That's more of a medium. So we take a look at that, and in our world, we assign high, medium, low values to these things. We have really good definitions, and then we assign a number. 3 is a high, 2 is a low, 2 is a medium, 1 is a low. So you can get a protection profile score, right? So then we look at all the threats that can occur, and we'll talk a little bit about what those look like here in a minute. So protection profile times threats equals inherent risk. Right? You guys familiar with the concepts of inherent risk and residual risk, right? Inherent risk is the risk what? Shout it out, somebody. Naturally present risk, the risk before controls. Thank you. The residual risk is the risk after controls, right? So inherent risk is the risk of doing business, the risk of having a thing, the risk of working with a vendor. And in most of these cases, it doesn't really matter what the name of the vendor is. Most of this stuff is going to be pretty similar until you get to the control level, right? How do you actually then mitigate that risk? Which we'll talk about in a little bit. That'll give you the residual risk. All right, so the goals of the vendor risk assessment, again, are number 1, to categorize your vendors. Not all vendors are created equal. We want to create some tiers to help us and use this risk management process to say, here are our most important vendors. We're going to do more to mitigate and manage the risk around those most important vendors, and we can do less for less important vendors. From a vendor selection perspective, that's going to help us answer the question, which of these vendors do we want to do business with? If we're looking at 3 different vendors, how do we make that decision? From an ongoing vendor management perspective, do we want to keep doing business with this vendor? So from there, we also need to, kind of like we talked about earlier with the protection profile, we need to determine what data is accessible to those vendors, and where does that data live? Does most of your data live on your physical on-premise networks anymore? Or is your data floating around all over the internet with vendors, right? So we need to determine where is that data living, because at the end of the day, who's ultimately responsible for the data no matter where it lives? You are, right? So this is the big risk that we've talked about all day long, right? It doesn't matter who gets breached. If it's your data, if you are responsible for that data, then you are responsible for the notification. You are responsible for what happens thereafter. So, and there's my cool, fun little callback. All right. All right. So, again, where does that asset live? Does it live on your network? Does it live with the vendor? Is it hosted? Is it in the cloud, right? So there's a difference between hosted at a data center and hosted in the cloud, technically speaking, from that perspective. Again, at the end of the day, what really matters is that it's your data, but there are going to be different controls that are going to affect you in that acceptable level of risk, depending on where that particular asset lives that you're getting from a vendor. So, as we talked about earlier, we want to get to that protection profile, and that is really the answer to the question of how important is this vendor, based on those 4 areas that we talked about earlier. Does this vendor store, transmit, and process confidential customer information? How much access do they have to this information? How critical is it that that vendor is available when you want them or need them, and how much stuff do you have with that vendor. So here's kind of an example, and I've got there's a little download icon. So this is one of the downloads. Anytime you see that little download icon, that will be available for download on this website. I'll pull that QR code up as we finish. Again, but here's kind of a sample spreadsheet vendor risk assessment. As you can see, you can look at the protection profile stuff there, sort of like we talked about. And we're also incorporating vendor threats. So we're not looking at specific IT threats like unauthorized remote access or unauthorized system access or unauthorized physical access or malware. We're looking at more high-level macro threats from a vendor perspective. We want to look at those IT-specific threats as we look at an IT asset. From a vendor perspective, we take it up a notch. So we're looking at operational risk, which is the biggest risk to your business or your organization. Something happens to this vendor, can we still do business, right? If the answer is it's a huge operational risk, and they're probably going to be one of your more important vendors. But we also take a look at financial risk, right? If something happens to this vendor, how much money is it going to cost us? Are we going to get fined? Are we going to have to do data breach notifications? Those types of things. Is there a regulatory risk, depending on your industry, as an example? What about reputational risk? Something happens to this vendor, they get breached. How big of a reputational hit do we take? And then there's a resource risk. Like if something happens to this vendor, how many resources are we going to have to dedicate to figuring all this out and getting this system restored? You also have to have really good definitions for these things, especially if you have a larger organization and you're pulling in a number of different people, you got a lot of vendors, you're not necessarily the closest to all of the vendors. Other people might be closer to these vendors. You might need to pull them in and help you make these determinations. Having really good definitions helps from that perspective. So for those of you guys that do vendor management, you go to any of your departments, whose vendors are the most important vendors? Everybody's vendors are the most important vendors, right? Just ask them, they'll tell you. But that's not always the case. That's why we build out kind of this quantifiable method to say, hey, let's all get on the same page and look at it objectively. Definitions are super important. So as you're building out your vendor management levels, as you're categorizing these things, we kind of break it down. We use 4 tiers. So there's no standard out there. There's not a lot of other organizations that even do this, to my knowledge. So these are the 4 categories or 4 tiers that we use. You can use your own. If you got 5 tiers or 6 tiers or 3 tiers, totally cool. But in our experience, these are the 4 that make the most sense. Number 1 is your organization-wide critical vendors. And then level 2 is your significant vendors. And those are going to make up about usually 20% of all of the vendors that you're looking at, but that's where you're going to spend most of your money and your effort, especially on a vendor management perspective, but likely as a company as well. You know, your biggest vendors, your most expensive vendors, they provide you the most stuff. Then you've got your non-essential vendors. Call it whatever you want, that's just what we call it. It's not that they're not important, but if something happens to one of those vendors, you can probably find another one without having a whole lot of business disruption. And then you've got your exempt vendors. They're going to rate out low enough where you don't necessarily have to do anything else. You risk rated them. You know, they're folks that you pay cash to. Maybe they take care of your landscaping, right? You know, they're on your accounts payable list, but you don't have to worry too much more about them than that. So just to give you an idea, because a lot of times we go to work with clients and they're like, we have 52 critical vendors. And we said, no, you don't. In our experience, most organizations have somewhere between 3 and 8 critical vendors, depending on your size and your scope, right? Again, most people are like, well, they touch confidential customer information. Cool, how much? 1 time a year. Well, they're not a critical vendor, right? So let's move them down a tier or 2. Again, the focus, the idea here is to create a process that places appropriate weight on the most important vendors and then scales the effort and the resource down a little bit as you go. So this is just as an example. We have a software that helps with this called Track. So this is a report that you can generate out of there to say, hey, here are your critical vendor lists by going through the protection profile and the threats. So from an ongoing, so that's kind of the vendor risk management, risk assessment concept. I hope that helps you guys. Just high level macro, like think through, hey, how can I make this quantifiable, repeatable, and a process, a risk assessment that can actually help me make good decisions at our organization. So now we're going to move over to the ongoing vendor management side. Like, what do we do with a vendor that we already work with? So again, we start with the risk assessment. We just talked about that number one decision is, do we want to keep doing business with this vendor? We've been doing business with them. Are they the right fit for our organization? But we start with the risk assessment. What level of protection profile or what level of vendor is this particular vendor that we're looking at in this case? And again, the depth that you go in terms of your vendor reviews is going to be dependent on the level of vendor. We're going to do all of the things for a level 1 vendor. We're going to look at all of the things over in that critical vendor document checklist. We're going to look for, usually you get a SOC report. Hopefully it's a SOC 2 Type 2 report for a critical vendor that provides you with technology solutions. But if not, then what other types of evidence or audit or assessment reports can they give you to say, hey, we're taking security seriously and we're having a third party come in and tell us what we're doing. And we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like in a little bit. Do they have an information security program? Do they have a business continuity plan or an incident response plan? Do they have insurance coverage, specifically cyber insurance coverage? Are they going to provide you with audited financials so you can tell if they're a financially sound organization? What's the contract look like? Do they do any sort of pen testing, vulnerability assessments, so on and so forth? If they're providing you with a software platform or a SaaS product, do they have a web app scan or assessment done? Are they testing their business continuity, incident response, disaster recovery plan? Great example from Chris Hoff this morning. So, and you can't just collect this stuff. You have to actually analyze it. You have to look at it and say, hey, are they actually doing something about this? Rather than just grabbing it, putting it in a folder, and sticking it on a share drive somewhere. So what do you look for? We're looking for red flags when it comes to these types of documents. And again, you want to do all of this stuff for a level 1. You can pare that down a little bit for a level 2. You can pare it probably down pretty significantly for a level 3. Maybe you only have a contract. Not even all level 3s have a contract. But maybe you just need a proof of insurance. That's probably an important thing for a level 3 vendor. For a level 2 vendor, maybe you don't require a SOC 2 Type 2, but some type of assessment, as an example. But we're looking for red flags. So this is kind of an example of how we would set that up in our tool, just to give you a visual to say, here's a level 1, we're going to look at all of the stuff. A level 2, we're going to pare it down a little bit. Level 3, we're just going to get insurance. And when it comes to SOC 2 Type 2 reports, when it comes to SOC 2 reports, what we're typically looking for is, especially for those critical vendors, is that SOC 2 Type 2 report. So, quick show of hands, who here is a pro at looking at SOC reports? Hey, all right, there's my people. All right, so just a quick differentiation here between SOC 1 and SOC 2 reports. Why do we want to look for a SOC 2 report? SOC 2 reports are based on, have a cybersecurity framework, kind of, called the Trust Services Criteria. So SOC 1 reports, the objective of a SOC 1 report is really to evaluate the controls around financial reporting. So the scope, the objectives, the control reviews are all set by the service organization being assessed, versus in a SOC 2, the controls are based on that security trust services criteria. And the controls include security, availability, processing integrity, confidentiality, and privacy. So more robust, not necessarily only scoped and set by the service organization. If it is, you can tell a lot easier. SOC 2 also includes processes for risk management and for vendor management, which is going to come in important here in a minute. So otherwise, quick question, who is required to have a SOC report? Anybody know? No one. No one is required to have a SOC report. It is a voluntary thing, right? Also, in addition to that, if anybody ever tells you that they are SSA 18 or SOC 2 compliant, they're full of crap. So don't believe them, because there is no such thing. They can go through a SOC report and give you the results, but there is no, it's not a checklist, right, that you follow. So be wary of that language. If a vendor is telling you that, dig deeper, ask questions. So when it comes to the next steps of ongoing vendor management, we want to do our due diligence and we want to look at a contract. Again, specifically for our mission critical vendors, our level 1 vendors, level 2 vendors, you can pare this down a little bit again too. But the due diligence is, what do you know about the company? And the contract review is, does the contract protect only the vendor, or does it also consider what our interests as the customer today? And I'll tell you, most contracts are the former, protecting only the vendor. So you've got to really look out for what contracts say. Especially around termination, like what happens if something happens with this vendor? How do we get out of the contract? In what scenarios, in what cases can we get out of the contract without paying a boatload of penalties? If the vendor gets compromised, if the vendor does not meet SLAs, if the vendor does not provide the support that they tell you that they're going to provide, if they're not a good partner, what are the cases for terminating that agreement? Is the vendor required to notify you of a security or cyber incident? Big deal, especially in today's world. A lot of old contracts don't have this type of language, so watch out for old contracts. Another question is, who owns the data? Typically clearer in today's contracts, but again, in old contracts, it can be ambiguous, so watch out for some of these big questions. We work, as I mentioned, a lot with regulated industries, especially in the banking sector, so they've got real strict provisions around vendor management. That's where a lot of this stuff emanates from, but it can scale really for any organization looking to make good decisions from vendor management. I have a question set that you guys can download as a part of the downloads here on the QR code on that page. So feel free to download that and use it. And the question set's adjusted between vendor levels, right? So it asks all of the questions for a level 1 mission critical vendor, fewer questions for level 2, level 3, so on and so forth. So again, we're looking for red flags here, right? And we also have, I have a specific SOC question set, if you guys want to download that guy as well. If you are reviewing SOC reports, it's 26, I think, questions, 26, 27 questions around a SOC report, what to look for, those types of things. If they're a cloud vendor, that's a little bit different. Their environment is a little different. If they're a foreign-based service provider, if they're outside of the country, that's a little bit different. There's different questions around, hey, are they required to follow the same laws and regulations that you're required to follow, so on and so forth. And recently, we just developed an AI question set. If you're not asking your vendors AI questions today, you need to start. Are you using AI on our products and services? Can we opt in? Can we opt out? What do you do with my data? Are you training your tool on my data? Who owns that data? Et cetera, right? So again, we're a pro AI shop here at SBS. It's maybe kind of weird, the cybersecurity risk management guy saying AI is awesome, because it is. A lot of applications and utility. Again, we've just got to manage the risk. So keep that in mind. And again, we've said this before, the more critical the vendor, the deeper dive into the contract review and the due diligence you want to do. Also, just quick note, we encourage our clients, if they're doing ongoing vendor management every year for their critical vendors, to go back and look at that contract every year. And you might say, well, it's the same contract as it was 10 years ago. Right, but we just talked about how risky some of those old contracts are. What are you doing about it? Because if you're just looking at it and saying, wow, well, we've had that contract for 10 years, nothing bad's ever happened, bad stuff happens, right? That's why we're here. So keep that in mind. And again, we're looking for these red flags. So we're going to get to now we're getting to the point where we're talking about acceptable levels of risk, okay? So we want to be able to define acceptable levels of risk for different types of vendors. So if you were doing back of the napkin math with me earlier when we were talking about protection profiles, a maximum, if we got 4 categories and we rate them on a 1 to 3, maximum category for a vendor is, a maximum protection profile for a vendor is a 12. So we kind of look at vendor levels and say, all right, how are we handling these vendor levels? So we're going to mitigate the most risk for our highest protection profile vendors, as you can see over there on the right. And we, want to be able to set those acceptable levels of risk, and then we say, okay, well, is this vendor meeting that acceptable level of risk? If so, thumbs up, gold star, let's move on. If not, then what do we do? So there are 4 outcomes, 4 ways to manage risk, period, end of story, right? We're just applying this to vendor management in this case. The first way is to accept the risk. You can say, hey, there's a risk, we accept it. Again, we can't mitigate all of our risk. There will always be risk. We can't get to 0. There will be risks that we have to accept. But you can't just bury your head in the sand and say, all right, well, we're accepting the risk, let's move on. You got to document it. You have to report it upstream. Say, hey, we got a risk over here. Let's talk about it. Let's report it. Let's document it. Let's make sure that it lives somewhere that we can look at later on and say, okay, we're going to live with this risk for now. The second way is to resolve the risk, which is to work with the vendor to eliminate the risk. Maybe they didn't give you some documentation that you asked for. Maybe there's a vulnerability in their code that they got to patch or update or push a new release for, whatever the case is. Because vendors would never, ever push risk down to you, the client, by making you use an old version of an application or non-install patches or something like that, right? Vendors would never force insecurity on their clients. Yeah, right. So, but again, how do you handle that? Those are the two, the 2 most common ways to handle that. The third is you can change the risk. Changing the risk means that you can find a new vendor. It means that you could bring the product in-house if it's outsourced and the vendor is extra, or the vulnerability or the issue is external. Or you can stop doing the thing, right? The last way to manage risk is to transfer risk, which typically means insurance. And I'm here to tell you that cyber insurance is good if you have good cyber insurance, but it is not a way to handle risk for your organization other than to help you recover from a monetary perspective. Cyber insurance does not help you with notifying your customers of a data breach, as an example. I mean, it can monetarily, but it's not going to help your reputation. So we don't really consider that an active way to manage vendor risk from this perspective. Cyber insurance is good if you have the right cyber insurance, not a way that we're doing this. So there's other ways to manage vendor risk outside of just the process that we talked about here. Sharedassessments.org is a newer-ish company, and it has some newer-ish products that are not as common as SOC reports, but we're starting to see more of them. The SIG is a standard information gathering questionnaire. That's a third-party self-assessment, so a vendor would share that with you as an example. It's pretty standardized. The VRMMM is a vendor risk management maturity model. That's a free download for you guys to also look at from a doing your own vendor management perspective. ISO 27002 has companies can get a gap assessment if they're a ISO 27001 and 2 shop, as an example. That's just another thing that we see on occasion. There's also a couple other products like tools out there to help you do vendor management. Archer, Conetrix, InContracts, Quantivate, Wolfpack are some of the ones that we've come across over the years, as well as our tool Track. So not trying to sell you, just give you an idea that there are tools out there to help manage this process. And then what about code reviews? So, if a vendor's providing you an application, whether it's a SaaS application or a physical download on your device application, has the code been tested, right? We've talked about SecOps or DevOps and DevSecOps a little bit here today. Are these applications coded for security? And then there are some newer continuous vendor monitoring services out there. They're probably 5 years old. UpGuard, Security Scorecard, BitSite, Dun & Bradstreet even have one. They purchased the FICO security score a couple years ago. They don't tell you the whole picture, but it's pretty good insight as to what are your vendors doing from a security perspective. Do they care enough, from a public-facing perspective? And then there's also data flow diagrams. We talked about where does your data live, especially today. A lot of your data lives outside of your network. Where's your data going? 10 o'clock on a Friday night, do you know where your data is, as an example, right? So data flow diagrams can really help you understand where your data is going, how it's being protected along the way, where it's being stored, transmitted, and processed, so on and so forth. Really good tool. All right, so last quick thing, selecting vendors. Similar process that we talked about from a vendor management perspective, but we're going to do a couple different things. We still want to start with our vendor risk assessment, and then we're going to kind of break it out by vendor level. We're going to do more stuff for more important vendors, as we talked about earlier. Some of the different things that we do here, you're looking at, hopefully, multiple vendors in this example. The more important the vendor, the more vendors you want to look at. If you got a level 1 mission critical vendor, you probably want to look at least 3 vendors and compare them. And there's a lot of good benefits to comparing multiple vendors. There might be security controls that one vendor has that other ones don't, that you didn't even know existed or were a possibility. Same with functionality. And then also it gives you leverage from a price perspective. So there are good outcomes. It's work, yes, but you're looking to get leverage and help your organization make a good decision. And hopefully, you're doing vendor selection before you sign the contract, this wouldn't happen to any of your organizations, I'm certain, that says, hey, guys, we got a new vendor, sign the contract, we turned it on, you want to do that vendor risk assessment for us now? That wouldn't happen. But hopefully we're doing this in advance. But regardless, again, here we want to use our metrics to make good decisions around what this vendor looks like, what those 3 vendors look like, what is the right vendor for your organization. And it doesn't have to just be about the metrics. It can also just be about, it factors in like your opinion, the usability, the functionality of this particular product as well. But again, that hopefully gets us to the which vendor do we want to do business with question. So that's an example of what a project might look like. And then last quick thing here, 4th party management, where you've got critical vendors that also have critical vendors. In our experience, it's really hard to do 4th party management. It's because Brian, let's imagine Brian is a vendor of mine. So Brian's working with, sir, what's your name? In front? James. So Brian's working with James, and James is Brian's critical vendor. I'm Brian's customer, or Brian's my customer, right? I'm Brian's customer. And I call James, and I'm like, hey, James, you're a critical vendor of Brian's. We do business with Brian. You've never heard of me before. We've never talked. But please, can you send me a whole bunch of confidential information, even though you don't know me, and I'm just randomly calling you, right? You gonna do that? No? Maybe credit card information, social security numbers, all that kind of thing? No, you're not going to, because we don't have a relationship. But Brian and I have a relationship, so we can work together to maybe do some vendor management from that perspective. So that's why fourth-party vendor management is hard unless they are publicly traded companies, and a lot of this stuff is public. So a couple good things to note. SOC 2 reports contain vendor management information. Are you guys familiar with the Move It breach from a couple years ago, as an example? Right? Sorry. Most SOC reports contain those vendors from your critical vendors from that perspective. And you can go out and look at some of those SOC reports and say, oh, shoot. We got critical vendors that were using Move It in this particular example. So that's one thing. And the other thing is to work with your vendors to make sure that they're doing good vendor management on their critical vendors as well. Again, it's an element of a SOC report, but if you're not getting SOC reports, you can still work with your vendors to do that. So that's all I've got for today. I'll be around outside here if you guys have any questions. Hopefully this was valuable to you guys. I'm going to put this QR code screen back up if you guys want to download any of the big takeaways or anything like that. Thank you guys again for bearing with us at the beginning. We appreciate you a ton.